There is no way that I can preach on this Sunday's text without also referencing last Sunday's text. And Pastor Mark preached a very fine sermon last week. I hope that at least many of you were here to be able to hear it. And his focus was on Jesus' line, but who do you say that I am? Because remember, last week's lesson started out with Jesus being there at Caesarea Philippi, and he says, who are all the people saying that I am? And you can almost hear it like a little popcorn thing, can't you? Somebody says, oh, some say you're like Elijah. Some say Moses. Some say one of these other prophets. Some say this. Some say that. Answers kind of coming from everywhere. But then Jesus asked the pointed question. Not who's everybody else say or what's everybody else think, but who do you say that I am? Now, a week ago, I got to preach at a church called Faith Lutheran in Brownstown. And one of the things they do is twice in the summertime, they have an outdoor service on a Saturday evening. And what they do is they have all this property there that they bring their tents, trailers, and they pack out, they camp out there all weekend long. And so we gather around a fire pit, get to have the time together there and do that. And when I got to that point where I was able to say that, and who do you say that I am? And just let the silence go. You know what sounded off? Crickets. It was perfect. It was like the pinnacle of my preacher existence right there. It actually worked. I'd heard the crickets earlier. It was like, they have to do it. They have to do it. When I first went, there was nothing. And then they sounded, and it was, yes. Thank you. Now, you're not going to hear crickets here this morning, and thank goodness for that. Some of you start looking around saying, whose responsibility is it to make sure that this is a cricket-free worship space, and start asking those questions. So we don't have that. But can't you almost hear that when Jesus asks, but who do you say that I am? And everybody's quiet. And finally, it's Peter. It's always Peter, is it, that speaks up and says, you're the Messiah. You're the one. You're the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. And he gets it right. He is absolutely dead on correct. And Jesus says to him, blessed are you, because you obviously didn't figure this out on your own. You had help from my Father in heaven. You had help from the Holy Spirit. You had help from divine ends. Because a lot of biblical scholars point this out. We really don't know Jesus as Messiah without the event of the cross and the resurrection. That is what confirms it for us. And of course, that hasn't happened in the story yet. And so what does Jesus do in today's lesson? He follows up and says, yeah, Peter, you're right, but this is what it means. Because so many people, and I loved Mark's line about this last week. He did this so well. So many people's expectation of what it meant to be a Messiah was to overthrow Rome. Mark had said, isn't that what every good Messiah does? Throw off Rome, have an armed insurrection, do all of those things and go. And instead, what Jesus says is, that's not the way of God's reign. That's not how things work. Instead, it's a path of suffering and even death. But then life and grace and love and mercy and joy. That's what it means to be the Messiah. That's what it means that God's reign is breaking in on us right here, right now, and people get to experience it. Well, what Peter hears then is all of that about suffering and death. And he does what is natural. You know, I think so many years removed later, we look back and we look at Peter and go, gosh, Peter, would you just get with the program? Would you just understand? Do you have to keep putting your foot in your mouth every single time? But I have to confess, I think I'd have been right there with Peter. He loves Jesus. He doesn't want this to happen to him. He cares about him. He doesn't want to see him being brutalized and tortured and killed and all the things that Jesus just talked about. That is not what he wants, and he will do anything he can to keep that from happening to the one whom he loves, who he values so much. That's what he wants to avoid. And in so doing, Peter ends up in this wonderful part, I think it's of all of our human condition, where we can be absolutely right and absolutely wrong at the same time in some big mixed up jumble. And so that's what I wanted to work with today, was that whole concept of sometimes we get it right and we do well. Other times, I know this is true of me, I can screw up like nobody else. I can make a mess of things. And yet still be the same person who did something well over here. That beautiful mixed up bundle that it means to be human. Now I'm going to share a story with you from me as a much younger person. It's not very flattering. Sorry about that, but here we go. There was a time when I was right about it at that point of graduating from being an acolyte in church to being an usher. And what this meant is, instead of sitting up front where the acolyte always sat, I got to sit in the back with the ushers. And that was cool, because that was sort of the fun place to sit. Because sometimes, sorry about this, when the pastor was up front speaking, that meant that we were kind of kibitzing with each other back there, making comments about it, pointing things out, doing stuff like that. And I can remember one such Sunday where that was going on, because it was this very lesson that was read about Jesus being at Caesarea Philippi and going into here. And Jesus, after Peter gets it right, and he says, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of the living God. He says, yes, and you are Peter. This is where he names him as Peter. Prior to this, he's always known as Simon. You are Peter, Petros, which in Greek means rock. And on this rock, I will build my church. And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Do you remember that from last week, those lines being spoken? And I remember jabbing the guy sitting next to me and kind of giggling a little bit at this line. This shows you my degree of sophistication and learning here, because what I said to him is, they said Hades. And they only said that because they want to avoid saying a different word in church. Because they don't want to say HE double hockey sticks. Remember the sophistication and advanced? Yeah. They don't want to say that. They instead want to say Hades. But Jesus never would have said Hades, because that's Greek mythology, and why would Jesus be talking about Greek mythology and all that kind of stuff? And then even later, I had further criticism of it, because Jesus says, and on this rock, I will build my church. I'm like, why do they have Jesus using the word church then? The birthday of the church is Pentecost, which comes after the cross, after the resurrection, when the Holy Spirit comes. That's what we talk about as the birthday of the church. He wouldn't have been talking about church back before then. And assured in my own brilliance, forward I went into the world, sharing that with anyone who would listen, and even some that wouldn't. I also have to confess, and they're both past now, but you should probably be praying for my parents, because I lived to be this long. I could be insufferably arrogant as a young man. And oh my goodness, do I still to this day owe them a debt for letting me make it this far. So off I went to college, knowing I wanted to be a pastor, studied theology, but I also took ancient Greek. Now, the Greek language that the New Testament is written in is not the Greek that is spoken today. If I were to try to go to Greece today with what I know about biblical Greek, I'm not sure I could either order a drink with my dinner or figure out where the bathroom is. I'm not sure either of those would work for me. But I got to learn the Greek of the New Testament. And I remember with almost glee with which I turned to the Gospel of Matthew, got here to chapter 16, found that, and I was going to show and prove to people I'd already told this story to. Remember that whole arrogant wouldn't shut up part? That how they had changed the translations from words that didn't make sense. And I got there, and sure enough, there it is, the word Hades, right there in the Greek. It's there. The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And again, that made no sense. If you know anything about gates, in ancient siege warfare, gates don't go moving out somewhere to prevail against something. Gates stay stationary. Even that doesn't make sense. Why do they have Jesus saying this? But there it was right there in the Greek. And there it was, the word for church as well, ecclesia. And guess what? It was time for me to learn something. And maybe quit pretending that I already knew everything. I learned about that word ecclesia. It was long before we started referring to the church that way with that. It means the gathering, the assembly, the people coming together. And so it made perfect sense. It was a word that was in use at Jesus' time, that he would use that to describe, you are Petros, and on this rock I will build my ecclesia, my gathering, my assembly, my people as they come together. Now I'm going to confess something else. I continue to struggle with that whole gates of Hades thing. All the way up to the year 2014. And yes, I was ordained back in 92. So even as a pastor, standing in front of people, I still didn't get it. But in April of 2014, I had the privilege of journeying to the Holy Land for the first time. And I got to go to Caesarea Philippi. Now, this much I knew about Caesarea Philippi. It wasn't a town that was there before the Romans came. It basically became a Roman military fort that then had a town grow up around it and go. And, Philip, who was the local ruler there, kind of was dumping money into it to please Caesar, named it Caesarea and Caesar. And he, but it was this Roman town that had a very much a Roman feel to it, which included all of their deities and everything else that came with it. And this one spectacular spot of Caesarea Philippi, there's this incredible mountain there. And from this mountain comes this cascading waterfall. But then instead of splashing on the ground and flowing out in front of you, there was actually a fissure in the rocks at the base of the mountain where you could walk right up to it, and the water went down below ground. And eventually, hundreds of yards later, it comes out in the form of a stream going out the other direction. But this water would come crashing down that way. And around that waterfall, they built up a temple to Pan. Do any of you remember Pan, the god? In case you're forgetting, the goat Saturn-shaped guy that was wine, women, and song, basically, was what he was about. And what people would do when they came to this temple, they would come with questions. What's the future going to be like? What is in store for me? What is coming? And those sorts of things. And they would come and ask this question in order to get their answer. And obviously PETA was not in existence back then, but they would take a goat, a live goat, who had done nothing to anybody, take this goat and toss it into that waterfall there, have it go down, disappear underneath, and then, depending on what came out the other end, and there was never a living goat option, but how that remains of the goat came out the other end, it would get you your answer for what your question was. And so in today's gospel lesson, when it says that Jesus was at Caesarea Philippi, this is where he was. Do you know what they called this magnificent temple that they built up in front of this waterfall on the face of this mountain going down? They referred to it then and still do today as the gates of Hades. And it finally made sense. Jesus is standing right there at the gates of Hades, and he says to his disciples, "Yes, Peter, you got it right. I am the Messiah, and this is what it means. It doesn't mean conquering. It doesn't mean doing things the way the world always does them. It doesn't mean that we're going to win this thing by might and by killing and by all the things that people expect. But rather, our way is a way of peace and of hope and of love and of joy." and the gates of Hades, whatever it is that people come up with, will not prevail against it. Now, in the midst of all of that, we come to today. I'm no longer that young, arrogant know-it-all that I was years ago. Now, I'm pretty clear that there's a whole lot that I don't know. It's one of those things, I think the more I've learned, the more I realize I have yet more to learn. And I try to approach life with a genuine sense of curiosity about why, what, how is this, and all of that. And you know what? In the face of this world, now we're not in Caesarea Philippi with a literal gates of Hades right in front of us. But I don't know if any of you are willing to join me in this confession, but sometimes I find our world confusing. Sometimes I even find it a little bit frightening. Sometimes I honestly have to confess, I don't know what the right next step is sometimes. But in the face of it, as Mark pointed out last week, Jesus' invitation is always clear to us. Take the step. Don't be afraid. Step forward, because in my grace, I've got you. I will always be there for you. I will always surround you with my love and grace. You know, people read this lesson, and the way we hear it in the English today, it really sounds like Jesus is being super harsh on Peter. You know, that whole, get behind me, Satan. It's like he's calling him the worst thing he possibly could. Well, Satan means tempter, source of temptation, because it is always tempting to try to do things in the way that our world, our culture, and everything else says, hey, do it this way. This works for us. But Jesus' way is different. Jesus' way is merciful and kind and gracious, always. And as I said, in the face of this world, all too often, I get it wrong sometimes. Well, here's the good news for all of us this morning. That yes, sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we're able to live out who we are and who God has called us to be, and we do it well. Other times, not so well, we have to admit. Now, you know that passage from last week that Jesus had too about whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. My goodness, I struggled with those as well. Because the way I read those, the way I'd heard those taught before, was that especially me as a pastor, and you know how the church for centuries has sort of claimed this, and you know that Peter therefore is the first pope, and the rest of us are through laying on of hands and our ordination services all connected all the way back, and that's sort of the source of our authority and everything else. And it comes to this passage, and there are plenty of pastors who will try to own this and say, whatever I bind here, or whatever I loose here, is bound or loosed in heaven. And I got to tell you, that hit me like a ton of bricks. Why do I have not only that authority, but that responsibility? How is it that I could do something here, and then the God who created me has to abide by that somehow? That never made sense to me. And then I remembered, Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven. Not, in a sense, in a way of where we go after we die, but of it being real and lived in the here and now today. And that what we bind, how we boundary things, how we loose things, whatever we do, not just by what we say, but by what we do, that is how people experience heaven, God's reign here on earth. And so it's not just my confession that I join Peter saying, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. But it's also how I conduct myself on a daily basis, being the experience of God's love and hope and joy for others that matters so much. My dear friends, when I'm honest with myself and I look in the mirror, I know all the ways I fall short. I know all the ways I don't measure up. I know all the ways in which I've disappointed others, and not just others, but even myself. And as the Apostle Paul put it, how far I fall from the full glory that I intended. But at the same time, I also get to confess that God's love and mercy and grace are there for me every single day, always. Did you hear that in the confession absolution that we spoke to begin this service? That God's forgiveness is there for us already and always. And in that spirit, yes, we mess up, but we get it right. In that spirit, Jesus invites us, step forward in faith. Live. Be the good news that others might experience. Amen.